So I think that's pretty exciting because now you're talking about a designer molecule or designer ingredient, if you will, that could be tailored to the needs. So imagine where you have an animal that has more, leaky gut versus another animal that has problems with regularity to the stool, so forth. Well, now you're getting into lest I say the precision nutrition, so precision nutrition would be your your yeast composition versus mine and so forth. But it's this whole idea of getting more and more tailored.
Hello and welcome to the Pet Food Science Podcast brought to you by Wisenetics. I'm Jan Sugodolski. I'm here a professor at Texas A&M University, and I'm trying or dedicated to bring you the newest insights in the pet food science industry. So I'm really welcome today Dr. Greg Sunvold. Hi, Greg.
Hello.
I've known you for a while. And Greg's going to talk to us today about yeast and yeast supplements and why yeast are important. So, Greg, what I like to do is I like actually that people introduce themselves, your career path. We have a lot of wide audience, all the way from experts, but also young students and graduate students. So I'm always interested in people's career paths, right? Where did you start, and what is your career path that you now ended up?
All the way back, I have an undergraduate in animal science. Was kind of destined to be an experimentalist because I was always experimenting with things on the farm, and had a meat science professor that guided me into the area of nutrition. I was actually interested in reproductive physiology, and he said, go nutrition. So I went to a master's degree at Kansas State University in ruminant nutrition. And so after a couple of years there, I'd realized that Dr. George Fahey at University of Illinois was well regarded in fiber chemistry. So I went to University of Illinois to do more of a basic program in study of fiber. And during that time, I was introduced to a company. At that time, it was called the Ives Company, and they were funding different research projects to George Fahey and his lab. And I picked up a number of those projects, and at the end of the day, I had enough for a thesis. So my thesis is with fermentable fibers in dogs and cats. I actually did some human, adult, and infant research at the same time during that, but the thesis work was really with dog and cat research. So very very interesting stuff. We were at the time studying the fermentable fibers and the short chain fatty acids that were being produced that hadn't been quantified before in the dog
Really?
and cat. And so it was pretty pioneering work, and we were just fortunate to be there at the time. And so I went from the University of Illinois, graduated, and moved to the Ives Company. I guess they felt good enough about me to hire me. So I went to work for them and worked there, and it was ultimately acquired by Procter & Gamble after about 5 years, and so worked total of Ives and P&G for about over 18 years. And my whole research was really kind of bracketed two areas. One was more the upstream area. We developed a clinical research program to help with claim support of our products. We were very involved with patenting our products. So I led the global patent efforts, the patent portfolio for the Ives P&G group. And then about halfway through that, I transitioned into more of a downstream role in formulation. And really got more involved with some of the product development stuff, kind of from an upstream level, but nevertheless doing product development work, and spent time within an engineering group. So I worked with engineers to develop some new technologies for making pet food, and then ultimately was involved with some outsourcing of product forms like soft, moist, whatever that we didn't produce ourselves. And so got involved with several contract manufacturers. So touched canned products, semi-moist, as well as the base work was kibbled manufacturing. After that, I left, and I did primarily consulting work for several years, and actually have done raw pet food research as well. So we were developing some stability technologies for raw foods, and in 2020, I started working for a group that does international shipment of kibbled pet foods and whatnot. So I've been kind of across the board. I have, I went into industry, Jan, because I was very interested in, making sure that my research efforts came to life, in terms of the real world, so to speak. But I do have several hundred patent and scientific publications to my name as well, because we were very interested in making sure that what we did, got out there to advance the science, and then certainly to protect our interests as far as some of the things that the companies were developing. So I've done both patenting and publication work. So.
For more than 20 years, BioOrigin manufactures high-quality yeast-based ingredients through a sustainable biotechnological process, guaranteeing full traceability from the crop to the bowl. Through specialization in the fermentation process, BioOrigin brings the right solution for specific nutritional, palatability, and health appeals, such as gut health, immune system, skin health, weight control, and more. BioOrigin's products are natural origin, non-GMO, and certified sustainable by Bonsucro. BioOrigin is your partner for high-quality, yeast-based ingredients to add value to pet foods worldwide. Learn more at bioorigin.net.
That's really fascinating. So all the way from rumen nutrition, right, and then pet food nutrition. And so what are you doing now? So you're kind of a consultant, or what is your current role now?
So the basic role that I have is working for this group that does international pet product shipment, and so we develop products as private label or support some brands that are sold internationally for that company. But so it's kind of the gamut. And by the way, I along the way I started my own pet supplement business too, so I've gotten quite involved in the supplement industry as well. So I like the supplement stuff because it is really a keen focus on actives, making sure that you can solve a problem, a mobility issue or a allergy issue, or things like this. So that's kind of the cool thing about supplement research or supplement product development.
So we started with fiber, and today we're going to talk about the yeast. So what is the yeast, and why is it important? Why do you think it's a great supplement?
Well, let's scroll back. So when I formulate either a supplement or a product, a food product, that is, I think in terms very much, Jan, of the microbiome. And I know with your research you understand, but for the audience sake, in I believe it was 2010, there was chartered, the human microbiome research effort, and that really catalyzed a lot of effort in the human side of the world. And they had, of course, any new development, you have to come up with a new term. So they had this microbiome term that was kind of invented at the time. But actually, guys like you and I have been doing, work in the microbiome space before it was called that. But it's this whole idea of what goes on in the gut really affects not only the gut, but the rest of the animal. And so, if you ask me from a formulation point of view, what are some of the tools you use, or what are the ingredients you use? I categorize them as tools: prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics. And I think the last category, I guess in two of those categories, and it depends on, I don't want to get in a whole definitions thing, but you could call a yeast anything from a pre, a pro, or a postbiotic, depending on who you're talking to and what their flavor is. But typically, if it's alive, then it's a probiotic. If it's a fraction of yeast, which is often used, it's a postbiotic. And again, there are arguments, but I don't want to get into all that. Anyway,
I hear you.
I think when I talk to younger folks in this area, what I say to folks, Jan, is that if you want to be really good at product design, formulating products, you have to not only understand things like AFCO and basic nutrition needs of the animal, but you need to understand what's happening with the microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, again, all the way back to that meat science professor that was advising me to go into the area of nutrition, you can so much affect, either good or bad, the health, the well-being, if you will, of that animal through what you feed it, and specifically what is happening in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a major flaw, if I can say it that way, of a lot of product design, is they just have not thought about the microbiome. And it's just, and on the flip, is there's so much room to enhance many products in this industry if you just think about how can you optimize the gut. Two statements for your audience, Jan. One, good health starts in the gut. And the second one is, what happens in the gut does not stay in the gut. It affects the rest of the body. And again, you understand that, but for your audience, I want to share that. I think those are two things to really think about, and whatever. So the yeast, let's talk about that a little more specifically. Yeast, there is, like I said earlier, there are live yeast, which I would say constitute the minority of the opportunities for formulation. And I say that because a lot of product forms are not necessarily friendly to live probiotics, live yeast, what have you. Okay, but there are opportunities for live yeast to be added to products. The major opportunity in the yeast world starts with brewer's yeast.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And then there are what we'll call the yeast derivatives. So these are fractions of yeast. It's not the whole yeast cell, it's a fraction of it. Brewer's yeast, candidly speaking, is a byproduct of the brewing industry. And if you want to put a marketing spin on it, you can call it a co-product. I don't care. It essentially is produced as a result of the beer brewing industry, right? So you brew the beer, and the residue is collected and dried off is the brewer's yeast, the spent yeast. But make no mistake, it's not just trash. It's not trash. It is really healthful stuff. I mean, it's used by humans as a health aid and so forth. Why is that? Because there's a lot of antioxidants in it. It's certainly a rich nutrient source. And so if we go into kind of the, why would you take yeast or any of these yeast derivatives? It is, number one, it's very savory. It's very palatable. Did you know, for your audience, did you know that roughly a third of all dry palatants have some form of yeast, usually brewer's yeast, in it? Because you have to have some filler in any formulation world. You have to gross to 100%. But the reality is, it's a nice filler, meaning it tastes good. It has a nice savory flavor to it. Umami, MSG, that's the flavor note if you're into the sensory world. So that's brewer's yeast. It also has a major antioxidant called xanthohumol, and there's a lot of literature. I did some research on this for a presentation I was doing earlier in this year, and there's a ton of research around xanthohumol as a powerful antioxidant. It's a strong antiviral. It's actually anti-tumorigenesis sort of entity. So it's brewer's yeast just has some really fascinating things associated with it. And I've glossed over even some of the basic stuff. Brewer's yeast is typically around 45% protein. Those amino acids are highly available. It is rich in several vitamins, including many of the B vitamins. It kind of and these are bioavailable. They're not unavailable, but they're very bioavailable from the brewer's yeast. These yeast fractions, to transition to that a little bit, yeast fractions are they can be either fractionated off of a brewer's yeast product, for example, or they can be purpose grown yeast. So there are techniques that some of the yeast producers will use to produce yeast and specific strains of yeast under very specific growing conditions. And they'll take those yeast, they'll dry them down, and then they'll refine that to take portion of that yeast out.
Okay, let me talk about the second part, the yeast fractions.
The yeast fractions can either be derived through fractionating out, say, portions of the brewer's yeast, and that is indeed done, or you can do what we call purpose-grown yeast. So in this case, the manufacturer will take specific strains of yeast that are known or purported to have benefits, and they grow them up under specific conditions. I do actually prefer the latter, the purpose-grown approach, and the reason is it's a more consistent product. And so, but in either case, what they're doing is they're searching for more active portions of the yeast. And so, it gets into, maybe it's a little technical for folks, but bear with me. So there are things like beta glucans and banana oligosaccharides are the two major entities that are talked about in the scientific literature from yeast. And beta glucans tend to have a gut immune sort of benefit. Beta glucans from some other products like oats or whatever are used more to slow down or attenuate the digestive process. In yeast, I think the bigger benefit of the beta glucans is more for perturbing the immune system in a way that modulates it to be more effective. Mannan oligosaccharides, the other second major portion that's sought after within yeast cell walls, are entities that you can think of them kind of like a prebiotic, but not in the sense that they grow anything, but they're basically like a fiber. They go through the intestine, they're not absorbed. They get down to the lower part of the intestine, and these pathogens, namely E. coli, would like to bind to things. They need to, bacteria in general seek to become resident organisms, and they do that by somehow affixing to something. So in this case, they affix to the mannan oligosaccharide, thinking they found a place to reside, in which case they just get flushed out with the feces, and that's preferable to them binding to the intestinal lining. And then if they do that, then they cause all kinds of havoc by residing in the intestine. So it helps keep them in a planktonic state. The microbiologists in the audience will thank me for that comment, but planktonic is just the fact that it's in fluid, it's in the liquid environment, and just gets flushed out, so to speak, with the feces. So that's the two main entities that are involved with yeast cell walls, and that's what's talked about most in the literature. And it's because of these health benefits that I've just named. But there are many other things that yeast can do. They can, for example, if they're growing or if they're serving as a food source for other bacteria, they can help lower the pH of the intestine. Generally speaking, that is a good thing because the lower pH discourages pathogen growth. It's anti-pathogenic bacteria survival. And certainly some of these yeast, as they grow, or if they're fed upon, can result in the short chain fatty acids. And perhaps many of your folks know that in your audience, but short chain fatty acids are trophic. They are building up in nature of the intestinal lining. They help the cells of the intestine grow and thrive, and that's important as well, as far as being healthful, health promoting. If I could take it a click down for those that are really interested in science here, there is literature out there that it's really cool. It's in they use a zebrafish as a model. So they've taken different types of yeast or fractions of yeast, and they will look at the expression of mucus on the outer shell of the fish. It's important for the fish because it's in a relatively hostile environment. It's in this aqueous environment with all kinds of potential pathogens or just opportunistic bacteria, what have you, that could cause problems to its own flesh. And so, as a defense mechanism, it produces these mucopolysaccharides, generally a mucus, the sliminess of fish. If you're familiar with fish, the texture of fish on the outside. Well, they use the zebrafish as a means to study mucus production. And I bring this up because I think it's an interesting model that some of these yeast fractions can promote mucus production. And if we think about it, the same is true about the intestine. The intestinal lining has to produce mucus to protect itself. Just like the fish, there are opportunistic pathogens or just opportunistic bacteria that could cause chaos if they were absorbed or even residing on the lining of the intestine. And so one of the ways the defense mechanism of the intestine in you or I or a dog or cat is to secrete mucus. So this zebrafish model is, I think your audience is probably getting it now, is like, okay, you can find ways to promote mucus production to help coat the lining of the intestine. You take that one more step then down the way, as I said earlier in the discussion, what happens in the gut doesn't necessarily stay in the gut. So if we have things that are moving from the lumen, the inside of the intestine, into the bloodstream, that's not necessarily a good thing. So what would be called a probiotic in the intestine, the lumen of the intestine, could be a real detrimental organism to have circulating in the bloodstream. It's then called sepsis or blood infection by an organism. And it could be even non-living things like allergens or other things that get into the bloodstream because of poor lining of the intestine. What happens then? Well, ultimately, and it's been shown in young children that if the immune system is not developed correctly, you will have an infant or a child that's more susceptible to atopic dermatitis. And so we're looking at potentially the same thing within the dog and cat realm. If what's going on in the gut is not healthy, you get translocation. And so coming back to the yeast, it becomes a tool for us to promote, a healthier lining, not only this mucus secretion, but then also a perturbation of the immune system. There are studies that have been done in dogs in particular that have shown increased IgA secretion into the intestine. Well, that's a function of the immune system that's been tuned up, in this case, due to a yeast cell fraction.
No, that's fascinating. I think
hopefully this has not gotten too deep for everybody, but hopefully it gives some interest to the audience.
It's really fascinating. The mucus layer, I think, is really for me intriguing because we know that this is a crucial defense mechanism that probably was underrated, right? And especially in GI disease, it gets eroded and so on. And so a natural way to stimulate mucus layer is really, really useful. I want to come back to one question to you about the beta glucans, because I think I see this more and more products now having beta glucans. So one question comes to consistency. Maybe that's a question is, are the different beta glucans are all the same, or is there different yeast can produce different beta glucans, and how can we know which one is better?
To my knowledge, the biggest difference between beta glucans is between what is in like a grain, such as oat, versus what's in a yeast cell wall. And I'm going to screw it up. I'm going to tell you it wrong, but it's a 1,3 and a 1,6 linkage, and I believe the yeast has both of them, whereas the oat beta glucan will have just one of them. Maybe I've got it backwards. Maybe but it's one or the other. And so that's the major difference. Now, can you change the composition of the beta glucan within the yeast cell wall? Off the top of my head, I can't answer that. I've not read that or come across that. That it's possible, I suppose, but I've not seen that done.
But it also means the source of the yeast or of the beta glucans is crucial, right? So that's fine. Not every beta glucan is the same.
I think too, certainly yeast sources can vary in terms of the amount of beta glucans as well as MOS. In fact, when you look into commercial sourcing of yeast, often times they are valued on the richness of beta glucans and MOS. I'm not necessarily a subscriber of that philosophy, because I think there are other benefits to yeast that go beyond just those two analytes, if you will. I mean, they are analytes. There's something you can analyze within yeast, and so it stands to reason people have looked at it as something to measure, and so we should buy on that basis. But I would say that there are many other things that go on with yeast, and I'm more interested in buying yeast sources and using yeast derivatives that actually have research behind them as far as their efficacy, and not just simply measured beta glucan and MOS levels.
It's time for our famous three.
Corbion's Algaprine DHA-P3, the algae-based omega-3 DHA to boost brain, cognition, immune system, and well-being. Adding it to pet food is easier than ever. Cut out the middle fish and go straight to the natural source to enjoy all the benefits of omega-3 DHA. It's better for the planet with zero impact on the ocean and low carbon footprint, and it's easy to use. The highly concentrated biomass powder is suitable for multiple applications. Learn more at Corbion.com.
Yeah, so we're surprised, but we're almost coming to the end of our episode. So I have two more questions. One question is, are there any potential negative effects that you envision of yeast?
Yeah, so
any negative things that you could say would be a risk?
Yeah, so on the subject of yeast, I think it's important to buy yeast from reputable companies that have some data behind them, because here's a case in point. There is such a thing as overstimulating the immune system. And I was just looking at this today, so I have it on the top of my head, but there's different receptor cells, receptor types for the immune system, related to the immune system of the gut. And Dectin-1 is something that is often used to promote or stimulate the immune system, but you can overstimulate it. And so if you work with a yeast derivative that can stimulate multiple sites, the chance of you overstimulating that immune system by just focusing on the one site is better to have it more diversified. So that is one risk, I would say. Another risk, if we go into live yeast discussion, and I can talk about this, maybe your audience would be interested in this, about the formulation levels of things. So I like to think in terms of 1 × 10⁸ to 1 × 10⁹ dose per day of live probiotics in general, but I would say in this case, live yeast, okay? There are folks that play the horsepower game, that more is better, is maximize, whatever. And I think that, once you're getting into, say double digit 1 × 10⁹, you're going into 1 × 10⁻⁻, whatever, you're kind of starting to tread on thin ice as far as, are you putting too much? Because really, I mean, you're putting a foreign live cell into the body. Even though it's yeast and you think of it as friendly, it is a foreign cell. So are we setting that animal up for some sort of autoimmune response or what have you? I don't know. So I would just temper and not get into that horsepower game of something beyond 1 × 10⁻⁻. I think is beyond the level of what you need to supplement with probiotics in general. So on that note, I'll just continue on that stream. Is like, so what are you formulating at? You're formulating at something like 1 to 4% brewer's yeast in a food product. In the fractionated world, the hydrolyzed yeast or the yeast extracts, you're formulating around that 0.1%, literally tenfold less, and doesn't seem like much, but the science is there, the research is there. At those lower levels, those yeast fractions can be healthful to the animal, and so it doesn't take much. And that's really the kind of the cool thing about it, is like it just doesn't take much to affect the animal in a good way. If you go into the ethanol yeast, so that's one thing I haven't talked about. So in the world of what's available for products, because there's so much ethanol being produced in the U.S. now, there's there's a byproduct of that industry, and that's simply labeled as dry yeast, but it's basically the spent yeast from the brewing industry for purposes of ethanol production for auto fuel. So it's basically corn that is being fermented by yeast, and then the residual yeast is collected off. That's going into products now as a dried yeast product, and it can be anywhere from 1 to, say 15, 20%, and even some of the vegan diets get into it at even higher levels, supposedly with no ill effects. So, but that's kind of the extreme of what you would use to formulate would be the dried yeast. Just in that case, it just becomes a nutrient source. In the vegan world, it becomes a replacement for the animal proteins that are normally added.
Well, another question is maybe just a very final short one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think the innovation is going to go? What's the future going to hold with yeast? I mean, all you told us is an exciting era, right? It's almost like every product should have yeast. What do you think would be really the big game changer?
I think what's very cool about this area is yeast are very definable. Like I said, purpose-grown yeast. So you define what are the strains you want to use. And then, interestingly enough, you can have the same strains, but you can grow them under different conditions. You can feed into the system, the reactor, if you will, different amino acids, different carbohydrate sources, and you can result in very different outcomes, very different yeast composition profiles. So I think that's pretty exciting, because now you're talking about a designer molecule or designer ingredient, if you will, that could be tailored to the needs. So imagine where you have an animal that has more, leaky gut versus another animal that has problems with regularity to the stool, so forth. Well, now you're getting into lest I say the precision nutrition, so precision nutrition would be your yeast composition versus mine, and so forth. But it's this whole idea of getting more and more tailored. And really, I think the cool thing about yeast is that it is relatively economical to do this. I mean, so much of the designer nutrition is theoretically possible, but impractical from a cost profile. But in the world of yeast, I think it's much more tenable to go down some of these designer routes.
And it'll be easy to use as a supplement, correct? Targeted supplements for individual patients. That's what you would see the future.
Yeah, and just like dogs and cats, I mean, we love the taste of it. Dogs, cats, they both love the taste of yeast. It's got a savory taste and what have you. And so, I mean, from an acceptability standpoint, it's usually, if anything, going to be a palatability enhancer. So.
Thank you so much, Greg. I mean, that was really very insightful. I learned a lot today. I mean, I know that yeast is something that that more and more companies are putting in their diets, but I was not aware there's so much science behind it and really the innovation behind it. So I'm really excited for the future.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Greg. I hope you're going to join us. Maybe we're going to have another episode and we can talk about the more yeast supplements in a few months or something.
Sounds good.
But with this, I would like to thank all of you for listening to us. So that concludes another episode of the Pet Food Science Podcast, brought to you by Wisenetics. Thank you for us joining today. Please sign up so you're always aware of new episodes, upcoming episodes. Please also leave a review or feedback. What other themes you would like to listen to. And until next time, my name is Jan Sokolowski, and I hope to see you on our next podcast. Bye-bye.